Tokyo, September 1945. The city was a skeleton of itself. Charred walls reached into a sky the color of smoke. Ash lay on the streets like snow, soft and silent, muffling the sound of footsteps. The war was over, but the silence felt heavier than any bombardment. In the distance, a column of American soldiers marched through the ruins, uniforms clean, boots echoing between the hollow shells of buildings. They had come as conquerors, but nothing in their eyes looked triumphant. A child stood by a broken doorway, no more than 8, barefoot, watching them pass. One soldier slowed, unhooked a small metal tin from his belt, knelt and opened it. Inside was something miraculous, food, real food. He placed it in the child's hands, nodded once, and walked on. The child didn't move. He simply stared at the warmth rising from the tin, the smell of beef and salt cutting through the stench of ruin. For years he had been told the Americans were monsters, but the monster had just shared his meal. That moment, quiet, almost accidental, marked the beginning of something the world hadn't seen before. A defeated nation discovering compassion in its conquerors. In the early morning of August 15, 1945, a hush fell across the battered landscape of Japan. The once mighty empire, forged in blood and myth, listened in disbelief as the voice of Emperor Hirohito, calm and distant, declared surrender. Crackling through broken radios and loudspeakers, the message was formal yet haunting. He urged his people to endure the unendurable. No one spoke. In homes that no longer had roofs, in train stations littered with the displaced, and in hospitals running on candlelight, millions bowed their heads, not in shame, but in exhaustion. For nearly 15 years, Japan had expanded through conquest, from Manchuria to Malaya, carried by visions of divine mission. But now the islands were cinders. Tokyo had been nearly erased in a single night of firebombing, with over 100,000 civilians killed as wooden homes were incinerated by American incendiaries. Osaka, Yokohama, and Nagoya followed, their factories and homes reduced to soot. The countryside fared no better. Rice paddies had gone untended, livestock slaughtered, fishing fleets sunk or scavenged. Hunger was no longer seasonal, it was national. People boiled bark, stole from graves, and fed their children glue made from tatami mats. The few trains still running carried skeletal passengers pressed against shattered windows, fleeing to nowhere. All the while, fear twisted deep inside every home. Propaganda had preached that Americans would show no mercy, that they would torture, violate, and destroy with glee. Parents rehearsed suicide drills with their children. Some clutched vials of poison, others built makeshift spears from bamboo. But when the surrender came, there were no final charges, no divine winds. Only a question hung in the smoke-filled air. What will they do to us now? On the other side of the Pacific, the American forces were preparing to answer that question. Not with tanks, but with trucks. Not with invasion, but with presence. The mission was called Operation Blacklist, and it tasked General Douglas MacArthur, already a legend in the Pacific theater, with an objective never before attempted in modern warfare: occupy a defeated nation, disarm its military, prevent civil collapse, and somehow begin to rebuild without reigniting conflict. It wasn't just a military operation, it was a psychological one. Japan had not merely been defeated, it had been humiliated, physically broken, and emotionally shattered. Yet the goal was not vengeance. Washington knew that a starving, angry population could easily erupt into chaos. MacArthur's orders were surgical: project strength but avoid humiliation, enforce control but offer dignity. Every soldier landing on Japanese soil was briefed with care. "You are not conquerors," MacArthur declared. "You are emissaries of peace." On August 28, 1945, the first Americans arrived at Atsugi Airfield, just outside Tokyo. The planes touched down under a sky still choked with haze. Streets were deserted, windows shuttered. Civilians peered through holes in charred walls, expecting gunfire. But what they saw were men in clean uniforms carrying crates and calm expressions. Rifles remained slung. No homes were raided. No vengeance was taken. Within days, a moment occurred that no one expected. A small boy, barefoot and thin, approached an American soldier. He said nothing, only looked up. The soldier knelt, opened his ration tin, and handed the child a piece of chocolate. The child didn't smile, didn't run, he simply stared. That piece of food, wrapped in olive drab paper, became a symbol. Word spread quickly. The Americans were not acting like monsters. They shared, They saluted elders. They bowed in return. In alleys and backstreets, quiet gestures replaced fear. What had been expected to begin with conquest began instead with a shared meal. It was a moment that, though small, rewrote the script of occupation. And it would shape everything that came next. The guns had fallen silent, but the suffering had not. With the nation's transportation shattered and supply chains in ruins, Japan teetered on the edge of mass starvation. The Ministry of Welfare estimated that without immediate intervention, millions could die by winter. Fields had gone fallow. Fertilizers and tractors were scarce. What rice existed was hoarded or lost to black markets. Rationing had become a formality, a bureaucratic ritual with no rice behind it. In cities like Hiroshima and Yokohama, survivors scavenged rubble for nails and roots, sleeping among the bones of bombed-out schools and factories. Public kitchens opened where possible, often serving only weak barley soup. Starving children waited in line for hours just to receive half a bowl. Transportation was paralyzed, bridges destroyed, rail lines twisted, diesel stocks evaporated. American military planners realized that without rapid logistics repair, even incoming food shipments would rot in ports. In September 1945, U.S. forces began reopening docks in Yokohama and Kobe, clearing debris to allow freighters carrying American grain and canned goods to unload. Rail engineers rebuilt tracks under military guard, often using scrap metal and hand tools. MacArthur's staff coordinated with Japanese officials to map distribution routes, assign station masters, and secure locomotives. The aim was immediate and clear: restore caloric intake before the cold months arrived. By October, emergency rations had begun flowing: flour, rice, lard, powdered milk, often carried in U.S. Army trucks and handed out directly by GIs. These weren't charity drops. They were acts of psychological warfare, designed to replace fear with dependence, suspicion with cooperation. Every shared biscuit, every bowl of beans chipped away at the myth of the monstrous invader. The battlefield had moved from islands to kitchens, and now food was the weapon of peace. But logistics alone couldn't rebuild trust. Behind the strategy was a deliberate moral calculus. General MacArthur understood that symbolism mattered as much as calories. In a land that had been fed stories of American cruelty, the simple act of a GI handing food to a Japanese child could shift generations of perception. His headquarters, now based in the Daiichi building in Tokyo, issued clear directives. Troops were to avoid arrogance, demonstrate courtesy, and offer practical assistance wherever possible. Military photographers captured staged yet authentic moments: soldiers mending fences, helping farmers unload sacks, sharing rations with school children. These images were published in Japanese newspapers, carefully curated to show Americans not as conquerors but as caretakers. Relief became narrative. Behind closed doors, MacArthur's staff also moved swiftly to involve Japanese bureaucrats in food coordination efforts. Allowing local officials to retain a role in distribution gave civilians a stake in their own recovery, reducing resentment. Black markets still thrived, but American patrols turned a blind eye to petty exchanges of flour and rice, recognizing that survival came first. Meanwhile, entire ships were diverted from European post-war zones to assist Japan. Between September 1945 and March 1946, over 800,000 tons of food arrived under U.S. command, an unprecedented logistical effort. Schools became feeding centers. Temples housed soup kitchens. Even former imperial warehouses were unlocked and repurposed. American field kitchens were sometimes set up in parks, drawing long, quiet lines of civilians too proud to beg, but too hungry to walk away. Each hot meal was a signal. The occupation was not about humiliation, but stabilization. This wasn't mercy alone, it was strategic empathy. Washington knew that a starving people would be volatile. MacArthur knew that dignity was the only way to keep peace. And for the Japanese, each tin of food handed to them by the very enemy they once feared blurred the line between defeat and deliverance. Something irreversible was beginning, not just in policy, but in perception. The war had ended, but the reconstruction of the Japanese soul had only just begun. For the average Japanese civilian, the first encounter with an American soldier was not just a political event. It was an emotional rupture. Years of wartime propaganda had painted the Allied invader as a beast in human form, tall, violent, sadistic, and cruel. School books had dehumanized Americans as grotesque figures, and government posters warned women to take their own lives before falling into enemy hands. So when the real soldiers arrived, young, clean-shaven men offering chocolate, biscuits, and hot stew, the dissonance was overwhelming. In neighborhoods like Asakusa and Sannomiya, the first acts of kindness were met with disbelief. Children flinched when GIs approached, then slowly reached for the food with trembling hands. Mothers stood back, watching the interaction as if unsure whether it was a trick. But time altered the atmosphere. Shared meals began to form rituals of trust. The moment a soldier would squat beside a child and offer a can of beans or a biscuit, he was no longer an invader. He was a lifeline. Civilians began to initiate timid greetings. Old men bowed. Little girls offered thank-you notes drawn in crayon. The transformation was not sudden, but it was powerful. Trust was being built not in speeches, but in spoons. One interpreter stationed in Yokohama wrote in his diary, "I saw a woman cry today when a GI handed her daughter a can of peaches. Not from sorrow, but from shock." That moment, repeated thousands of times, formed the emotional foundation of a post-war peace no one had imagined possible. In these quiet exchanges, the enemy became human. And for those who had only known fear, the first taste of kindness came with the warmth of food. What made these moments of kindness possible was not chance, but command discipline, a deliberate top-down strategy enforced with military precision. General Douglas MacArthur, fully aware of the explosive potential of occupation, knew that a single misstep by an American soldier could unravel months of planning. Japan had surrendered, but it had not embraced the occupier. Civilians watched every movement of the GIs. Would they loot? Would they abuse their power? Would they behave like conquerors? MacArthur issued strict orders. Weapons were to be carried pointed down, helmets worn but not intimidating, and interaction with civilians governed by politeness, restraint, and professionalism. Troops were briefed before deployment with cultural orientation sessions that emphasized humility and awareness. No soldier was to enter a home without invitation. No food was to be taken without compensation. No retaliation was to be exercised even if provoked. Violations of conduct were punished swiftly, not only for legal reasons but to protect the fragile legitimacy of the occupation. Military police units shadowed patrols, not to protect them from civilians but to ensure that discipline remained absolute. In many districts, soldiers operated without loaded weapons, relying instead on posture, body language, and calm routines to project authority. They walked the streets in pairs, offering first aid, helping repair water lines, even directing traffic when civilian services collapsed. In return, Japanese civilians, cautious at first, began to lower their guard. The absence of violence became its own kind of language. In a nation where the sword had been sacred for centuries, Americans brought something more disruptive: the absence of the sword. It was a radical form of control, not through domination but through restraint. Over time, the people noticed. Even those who resented the occupation could not deny one thing: the Americans behaved with order. And in post-war Japan, order meant safety, and safety meant survival. Behind every biscuit shared on a rubble-strewn street was an enormous machinery of planning, coordination, and improvisation. Feeding a devastated nation was not merely a matter of compassion, it was a logistical war of its own. The United States Army, through MacArthur's command and Allied cooperation, began one of the largest post-conflict supply operations in history. Japan had no functioning food distribution system. Railroads were crippled, trucks scarce, and fuel practically non-existent. The few usable docks in Yokohama, Kure, and Kobe were filled with debris and wreckage from air raids and scuttled ships. Before food could reach mouths, it had to cross oceans, unload at half-functional ports, be transferred to temporary depots, and then hauled across bombed-out rail lines and dangerous mountain roads, often by hand, cart, or military convoy. Every calorie that reached a starving child in Hiroshima or Sendai had passed through dozens of hands. Quartermasters, engineers, medics, translators, and drivers who worked round the clock, often sleeping in their trucks. Field kitchens were set up in parks, temple courtyards, and burned-out schools. Rations included powdered milk, canned beans, army biscuits, and flour shipped directly from American stockpiles in the Philippines and Hawaii. When ports couldn't keep pace, cargo planes were rerouted from combat duty to fly in emergency supplies. Even the Red Cross, initially focused on POW repatriation, was retasked to assist with civilian feeding centers. U.S. soldiers weren't just delivering food, they were cooking it, organizing queues, calming crowds, and coordinating with Japanese officials to prevent riots. In many cities, locals began to view the olive-drab food trucks with a mix of reverence and relief. The military wasn't just enforcing peace, it was supplying life. And while propaganda had long portrayed Americans as brutes who would starve the population, the reality was now undeniable. The occupiers were not hoarding food, they were handing it out. And in doing so, they transformed logistics into diplomacy and supply lines into symbols of something far greater than victory. No individual shaped the early occupation of Japan more than General Douglas MacArthur. A war hero from the Philippines and the architect of Pacific strategy, MacArthur arrived in Japan not merely to enforce surrender, but to rebuild a civilization. From his offices in the Daiichi building, overlooking the imperial palace, he orchestrated every detail, from constitution drafting to school reform, but none of his decisions were more immediately felt than those related to food. He knew that feeding a starving population wasn't just a humanitarian act, it was the only way to prevent rebellion, disease, and political collapse. His leadership fused empathy with iron command. When supply chains lagged, he bypassed red tape. When field reports warned of local starvation, he shifted entire military convoys to deliver rice, lard, and powdered milk. He did not delegate crisis, he acted. His personal presence mattered too. MacArthur was seen regularly by both American troops and Japanese civilians. Tall, composed, always in uniform without medals. To some, he resembled a benevolent emperor, a paradox that the Japanese found easier to accept than they expected. He ordered soldiers to model behavior, respectful, calm, composed. Every American gesture in public, handing a child a ration, assisting an old man, bowing at a shrine, was part of a larger choreography. But it was not performative. MacArthur believed Japan could be turned from a former enemy into a future ally, but only if trust was built block by block, meal by meal. He used food as strategy, compassion as policy, and he moved swiftly to make the Americans not just the enforcers of peace but its face. In a world shattered by war, MacArthur's leadership introduced something few had imagined possible: a victorious military force acting as both conqueror and caregiver. For over a decade, Japanese society had been conditioned to believe that surrender was worse than death, and that Americans were little more than beasts in uniform. The military regime flooded schools, newspapers, and radio broadcasts with images of the foreign enemy, towering, pale-skinned, grinning devils who would defile Japanese women and torture their families. Children practiced bayonet drills against straw dummies marked as Yankees. Women were told to save a final dose of poison for themselves and their daughters. These beliefs weren't fringe. They were embedded into the fabric of national survival. The only way to stay Japanese, the story went, was to resist until death. And then within days of surrender, those very monsters were walking calmly through the streets handing out food. They didn't burn homes. They didn't strike women. They bowed. They shared. And perhaps most shocking of all, they smiled. This sudden rupture in reality left many civilians psychologically disoriented. Was everything they had been told false? Or were these gestures a trick? Some feared a trap. Others, particularly children and the elderly, accepted the kindness immediately, as if clinging to a lifeline they never expected. Japanese soldiers returning from the front were stunned to see their former enemies treated with gratitude. In public markets, whispers circulated that the Americans had more discipline than the imperial police. In temples, priests who had once blessed kamikaze pilots now watched American soldiers quietly help rebuild shrines. This reversal of the enemy image did not happen instantly, but the first acts of compassion cracked the foundation of nationalist myth. It was not victory that undid the ideology of hatred, it was behavior. In every shared meal, every offered blanket, every moment a GI helped repair a child's sandal, the occupation rewrote the mental picture of the enemy. The war had made the Americans terrifying. The peace made them human. Beneath the shared rations and careful bows lay a deeper reality. The occupation of Japan was not just a military operation, it was a moral and political experiment. Never before had a modern democracy attempted to transform the very soul of a defeated empire, not through domination, but through dignity. Every meal shared with a civilian, every moment of restraint from an American soldier carried weight beyond the street. It was diplomacy by action. Washington understood that the world was watching. The Soviet Union lingered on the periphery, hoping to expand influence in Asia. European colonies in the region were collapsing. For the United States, Japan was not only a broken enemy, it was a proving ground for American ideals. If democracy could be built amid ruins, if former enemies could be turned into partners, then perhaps the post-war world had a future beyond fear and walls. But none of that could happen if the people of Japan were starving. Morality and politics converged in a single principle: legitimacy. An occupation imposed by force alone would be resented and resisted. But one grounded in discipline, empathy, and sustenance could foster genuine cooperation. MacArthur's team understood this, and so did Washington. The occupation's legitimacy wasn't declared. It was earned in long food lines, in reopened schools, in thousands of daily, untelevised acts of decency. As rations flowed and discipline held, an unlikely respect began to grow, not of ideology but of conduct. American behavior did what military victory alone could not. It made peace acceptable. Japanese intellectuals and former officers, once fanatical in their devotion to the emperor, began speaking of reform. Newspapers began cautiously praising the orderliness of the new authorities. The Americans had not come to humiliate. They had come to stabilize. In a century of brutal empires and scorched earth defeats, this was something new. Food was not just nourishment, it was legitimacy. And in that fragile legitimacy, both Japan and America began constructing the first bricks of a new alliance. By November 1945, the kindness of individual soldiers was no longer enough. Japan was sliding toward catastrophe. The first post-war winter arrived early, sweeping through cities where homes were windowless, blankets were few, and food stocks were vanishing. Across the nation, calorie intake for civilians dropped to below 1,400 per day, barely enough to sustain life, especially in the cold. In Sendai, police recorded cases of families sleeping huddled inside burned-out train cars. In Kyoto, teachers fainted from hunger in classrooms. Mothers pawned wedding rings for handfuls of millet. MacArthur's administration realized that without rapid intervention, the population could revolt. Not out of hatred, but from pure desperation. Whispers of looting and unrest reached SCAP headquarters daily. In some towns, mobs gathered near train depots hoping for crumbs from army supply convoys. But this was the turning point. What could have become chaos turned into order, not through military crackdown but through logistics and empathy on a mass scale. The U.S. occupation authorities launched what they called food priority corridors. Docks at Yokohama and Kobe were cleared to receive non-stop shipments from American depots in Manila and San Francisco. Food that had once been rationed to soldiers was redirected to civilians. Canned meat, powdered milk, rice, wheat flour, even chewing gum, was stacked in military trucks and distributed to city relief stations, often guarded not by soldiers but by interpreters and Japanese volunteers. American troops coordinated with local officials to build soup kitchens and temples, parks, even former military barracks. In Hiroshima, survivors lined up in silence beneath the ruins of the dome, waiting for bowls of hot barley stew ladled out by men who just months ago had bombed their city. The tension in those lines was unbearable. Veterans of the Imperial Army stood beside orphaned children, accepting food from the hands of their conquerors. But the soldiers did not gloat. They offered meals without ceremony, then moved on. This system was no longer improvisation, it was a campaign. Japan wasn't just being occupied. It was being fed. At the heart of this transformation were choices made at the highest levels. General MacArthur, receiving urgent field reports about collapsing food access in remote regions like Tohoku and the mountainous interiors of Shikoku, escalated his response. In January 1946, he issued emergency orders to divert military shipping lanes to prioritize grain transport into Japan, even at the expense of U.S. troop comfort and supply. One shipment carrying winter uniforms for soldiers was famously offloaded to make room for rice. MacArthur knew that optics mattered, but survival mattered more. In coordination with the Far East Command, He approved the deployment of additional mobile field kitchens, staffed with both American personnel and Japanese workers, paid modest wages to help restore dignity through labor. GIs were no longer just guarding warehouses or walking patrol. They were teaching sanitation techniques, inspecting local wells, and showing farmers how to apply fertilizer to revive failing crops. American cooks trained Japanese volunteers in mass feeding techniques. In Osaka, an abandoned rail station was turned into a fully functioning bakery run on U.S.-provided flour and yeast. Perhaps the most symbolic moment came in March 1946, when a group of American soldiers organized a community meal in a public plaza in Kawasaki, a place where, less than a year before, bombing had reduced blocks to ash. Hundreds gathered. There were no speeches, just food. A soldier handed a small boy a ladle of hot stew and patted his shoulder. The boy bowed, then stepped aside. A mother followed. Then an old man. Soon the square was filled with the steam of metal pots, quiet chewing, and an overwhelming sense of something changing. These were not just meals. They were moments that rewrote memory. And though poverty and suffering continued, something irreversible had occurred. The occupation, once feared as a campaign of humiliation, had become a bridge. In that stew, in those silent lines, the myth of eternal hatred faded. For both occupier and occupied, the war had not only ended, it had begun to mean something else. The enemy had become a caretaker. And in feeding a nation, the United States had done what no rifle could. It had made peace feel real. By the spring of 1946, Japan was still hungry, but no longer starving. The massive American food effort, combined with gradually repaired infrastructure, had pulled the country back from the brink. Daily calorie intake rose to just above 1,800 per person, still far below healthy standards, but enough to keep the population standing. Bread, barley, and rice made it into homes again, though meat remained rare. Soup kitchens still operated in thousands of locations, but queues were shorter, and voices in line had begun to carry conversation instead of silence. Children laughed again. Newspapers that once only printed casualty lists began running school schedules and job postings. Black markets, once the shadow economy of survival, began to fade as legitimate rationing resumed. In cities like Sapporo and Nagoya, small shops reopened, men in suits and women in kimonos returned to train platforms. Life, if not normal, had become bearable. American soldiers were now a daily presence, not as feared occupiers, but as part of the rhythm of recovery. They could be seen playing baseball with children, helping deliver water barrels to hospitals, and coordinating with local officials to restore electric lines. The uniforms still marked them as foreign, but the fear had drained from the encounters. In public opinion surveys conducted by SCAP in mid-1946, a surprising trend emerged. A majority of Japanese respondents said they trusted the American military more than their former government. This wasn't born from ideology, it came from action. They had seen who fed their children, who kept order without cruelty, who knelt to help the elderly cross bomb-cracked streets. American newspapers began publishing editorials about the miracle of discipline among occupation troops. In the Tokyo suburbs, local festivals returned, now with American GIs invited as guests, not rulers. And in towns where fire once fell from the sky, people were now planting crops with seeds flown in by the very hands that had once brought war. The soil was still scorched, but something had begun to grow. Trust. The effects of that first year of occupation extended far beyond food. What began as emergency relief evolved into the foundation of a social and political transformation. By mid-1946, MacArthur's administration had introduced a series of sweeping reforms: land redistribution, labor rights, women's suffrage, all under the fragile but growing stability made possible by those first meals. Hunger had been the greatest threat to order. Once it was contained, Japan's reconstruction could move forward. American and Japanese officials began co-managing ration centers and planning crop forecasts. Rural cooperatives were revived. Railways resumed full schedules. Even former imperial warehouses were converted into distribution hubs under civilian oversight. Japan was no longer simply being fed, it was participating in its own recovery. This shift wasn't accidental. MacArthur's team had deliberately involved local authorities in food governance, helping rebuild administrative trust while reducing dependency. American military kitchens scaled back by late 1946, replaced by Japanese-run soup halls using imported staples with local vegetables. Where there had once been dependence, there was now cooperation. But perhaps the most powerful change was psychological. The very image of the enemy had been rewritten. Civilians who once feared death at the hands of foreign soldiers were now inviting those same soldiers into their homes. In Shizuoka, a group of schoolchildren who had once trained to repel invaders with sharpened bamboo poles now made thank-you cards for the GI field cooks who served them stew. In Kyoto, temple priests blessed American medical units alongside Japanese nurses. And in the heart of Tokyo, a mother told a reporter from Stars and Stripes that she had named her newborn son Mac, not out of politics, but out of gratitude. This was not manufactured propaganda. It was the organic result of behavior observed, experienced, and remembered. American restraint had not only prevented resistance, it had planted the seeds of alliance. When foreign policy experts in Washington reviewed the first-year reports from Japan, many were stunned. They had expected tension, protest, maybe even guerrilla insurgency. What they found instead was something rarer, a quiet admiration built from rations, rice, and the absence of cruelty. In feeding their former enemies, the Americans had helped Japan rediscover its future. History rarely offers second chances. And yet, in the streets of post-war Japan, amid the ash and hunger, a second chance unfolded, not only for a nation but for the very concept of peace through behavior. For centuries, surrender had meant subjugation. Armies triumphed by humiliation. Occupiers ruled by fear. But in Japan, after the most devastating war the world had ever seen, something different emerged. The victors came not to desecrate but to restore. They brought food, not flags. Cooperation, not chains. The same American hands that had once released bombs from B-29s were now stirring barley stew in dented pots and handing it to the children of the defeated. It was not charity. It was policy, born from necessity and executed with uncommon restraint. What resulted was not instant reconciliation. It was a slow erosion of hatred replaced not by love but by understanding. And in international relations, understanding is often more powerful than affection. In the line outside the soup kitchen, in the handshake over a ration ledger, in the silent bow between a GI and a grandmother, peace was not declared. It was built, brick by brick, bowl by bowl, word by word. This did not mean that all wounds healed cleanly. There were those who resented the occupation, who saw every act of generosity as a humiliation in disguise. Former imperial officers who had spent decades training for victory struggled with their reflection. Civilians who had lost everything, to fire, to famine, to surrender, felt a grief that food could not fill, but even they could not deny what they saw. The Americans did not plunder gold or monuments. They did not desecrate shrines or ban language. They brought textbooks, generators, medical supplies. And they brought rules that applied to themselves. Soldiers caught abusing civilians were court-martialed, sometimes publicly. American officers insisted that Japanese civilians be treated with respect equal to that of allies. It was not perfect. There were mistakes, frictions, abuses, but they were the exception, not the policy. For a people taught that defeat meant annihilation, this was the greatest shock of all. The conqueror had come not as a tyrant but as a custodian, and this redefined the very psychology of post-war Japan. The old values of death before dishonor gave way to something more pragmatic, survival with dignity. And that dignity, offered in bowls of rice and bread, reshaped a nation's soul. It didn't erase the past. It gave it somewhere to go. In the years that followed, the memory of shared meals during the occupation became a quiet thread woven into the Japanese post-war identity. They were rarely talked about in speeches or textbooks, but they lived in stories told at family tables. A grandmother would mention the American soldier who gave her brother his first taste of milk. A father would point to a park bench and say, "That's where the GIs handed out bread during the hard winter." These were not grand historical moments. They were small acts, repeated 1,000 times a day across a wounded country, and their impact far exceeded the calories consumed. In rebuilding Japan, America did not win over hearts with ideology or power, but with behavior. The Japanese people had seen what Americans did when no one was watching. They had seen soldiers stand in line for water like everyone else. They had seen medics treat Japanese children before their own. They had seen a foreign army arrive and not destroy what was left, but help sweep the streets. In a nation obsessed with manners, this discipline was noticed, and it was remembered. When Japan rose again, as an industrial power, as a democracy, as a global ally, it did so carrying the memory of rations handed across the line of enmity. Food had not just saved lives, it had saved relations. And what of the Americans? For many of the young GIs deployed to Japan, the occupation became one of the most formative experiences of their lives. They had been trained to kill, to destroy bunkers, to survive on instinct, but they found themselves instead managing food lines, rebuilding schools, and learning how to bow and greeting. Many had never left their home states before the war. Now they stood in Buddhist temples beside men who had once fought against them. They saw the ruins of a nation and the resilience of its people. And perhaps for the first time, they understood what victory could mean when it wasn't measured in enemy dead, but in lives rebuilt. Some returned home with stories of kindness from Japanese families who offered them tea, despite having little to spare. Others stayed, marrying locals, raising families, and becoming part of the bridge between two worlds once divided by hatred. In veterans' letters and memoirs, many said the occupation taught them more about humanity than any battle ever could. "We expected enemies," one soldier wrote. "Instead, we found neighbors." And for a country like the United States still defining its post-war identity, this moral high ground proved invaluable. In a century that would soon divide into Cold War camps and ideological crusades, Japan became the first major success story of peace built through behavior, not bombs. In the ashes of defeat, Japan found the roots of rebirth. And in the eyes of starving civilians, American soldiers found the quiet weight of responsibility. This was not the story of saints or saviors. It was the story of people who, in the aftermath of horror, chose discipline over vengeance, humanity over pride. The greatest victory in post-war Japan wasn't military, it was moral. And it came quietly in the clink of ration tins and the steam of barley soup. In the end, it was not war but a meal that reshaped history.